You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 31st of January 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. Coming up on today's programme.
وبعد إجراء التحقق اللازم واتخاذ كافة التدابير ذات الصلة.
Hamas confirms that its long-serving military commander is no longer with us. Why now? We'll also be joined by the journalist Peter Greste on hunger strike in support of a former Egyptian cellmate. Also ahead, can even AI figure out how much AI has been disrupted this week? And
we have everything Europe needs for industrial autonomy. And at the same time, we are in the bastion defense of the Russian army.
We'll meet the Norwegian mayor who can just about wave to Russia from his office. Plus, a wrap-up of the latest theatre news. That's all coming up right here on The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Welcome to today's edition of The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. Hamas has confirmed the death of its senior military commander, Mohammed Deif. They have taken their time over this. Israel claimed as far back as August that they'd killed him with an airstrike on Khan Yunis in the Gaza Strip the month previously. Deif had commanded Hamas's military wing, the Azzedine al-Qassam brigades, for more than 20 years and had been accused by Israel of being one of the principal organisers of the Hamas attack on Israel of October 7th, 2023. Layla Molana Allen, Monocle's Middle East correspondent, joins us now. Layla, why wait? Why take this long to confirm what was generally assumed?
Well, there are a couple of possibilities. There were also the deaths of 4 other major Hamas military commanders also announced yesterday. One is the more simple possibility that they simply could not actually confirm it. A lot of people, a lot of commanders, a lot of major figures in Hamas have, of course, taken to ground, have been hiding underground. They say they wanted absolute confirmation that these people, and particularly Deif, were dead and not just in hiding, and that they've only been able to do that since the ceasefire, since everybody's been able to sort of come up from ground. As we saw the day after the ceasefire, hundreds of Hamas fighters out again in the cities of Gaza who had been in hiding while they were fighting. So that's the sort of more straightforward reason. The other reason, which is very likely, is that he was such a towering figure. This is a man, Mohammed Deif, who commanded the military brigades of Hamas for 20 years, more than 20 years, who was responsible for many of the most outrageous terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians on buses, at bus stops, at cafes. So he's really sort of known as having led some of the most intense fighting and some of the most intense terror attacks, as well as you say, having been one of the main orchestrators of October 7th. There was actually a voice message, very rarely, distributed amongst Hamas members on the morning of October 7th from Mohammed Deif himself, announcing the launch of what they call Operation Al-Aqsa Flood and encouraging fighters to go and fight. So such a towering figure that really what's very likely is that Hamas simply didn't want to admit to so many of their major figures being taken out to reduce morale amongst fighters.
Well, with Deif gone and of course Yahya Sinwar gone, Ismail Haniyeh gone, and as you've suggested, many other senior Hamas figures all gone, do we actually know who is in charge at the moment?
So in terms of the military wing, in terms of inside Gaza, Mohammed Sinwar, Yahya's brother, does seem to be running things on the ground. Of course, political leadership is still happening out of Qatar and abroad. But they do have a big job now to sort of reorganize themselves. Now, the issue here, of course, is, Israel said that its objective was to completely wipe out Hamas. That was realistically never going to happen. You don't eliminate an ideology by killing people, by eliminating the fighters. You eliminate an ideology by producing a better option for the people who are being co-opted into that ideology. And of course, what we saw immediately after the ceasefire was the thousands of new recruits that Hamas has already been able to, pass this ideology onto because of what those young people have seen during this war. That's always been the case, that Hamas systematically targets the children and family members of people who have been killed by the IDF. to tell them that the only way to fight back is by joining this terror organization. So what they've got at the moment is they've got a large amount of manpower again, but untrained manpower. Obviously, a huge breakdown of their facilities across Gaza, and they don't really have that really experienced leadership that they once depended on. You know, the people who fought for decades in the trenches, the people who have fought all these terror campaigns against Israel. They don't have any of that background knowledge. So that's what they're going to be looking to try and build up now. And that, of course, is what Israel is so concerned about potentially happening during this ceasefire period and allowing them to sort of rebuild their ranks. But it won't be an easy feat. They really have lost a huge amount of sort of institutional knowledge in that terror organization.
Do we know whether or not Hamas have recalibrated their ambitions over the last 15 months or so? Because it's fairly clear that whatever the post-war arrangements in Gaza are going to be, Israel will absolutely not tolerate Hamas having any part of that. And it's frankly unlikely that many other Arab governments would be enthused by Hamas participating in the future governance of Gaza.
So this is a huge challenge. I mean, the first question is, what is left to govern? 92% of homes, of towns, of villages in Gaza have been destroyed or partially destroyed. That's an unbelievable statistic. This place has been devastated. At least 50,000 people are dead, but there are likely tens of thousands of more people dead under the rubble. Most of them civilians, because they would have been inside civilian homes. And of course, there is no, inside Gaza, they're not allowed to have heavy duty machinery to remove that rubble. So that's what they're going to be starting to do now if this ceasefire does continue. So how do you even govern an area like that? Where is the money going to come from to rebuild this place? Are people going to want to stay? Where will they go if they are allowed to leave through the Rafah crossing? Where will they live? Will they be accepted as citizens in other places? Who's going to fund it? The other big question is, how do you choose that leadership? It's very clear that the Palestinian Authority, which runs the West Bank, is going to be completely unacceptable. The Palestinian Authority has become essentially a shadow of a governing organization. They are considered as widely complicit with Israel, particularly at the moment where they're helping facilitate IDF troops raiding camps and towns inside the West Bank. They will not be accepted by the people of Gaza. And of course, there have been no elections. There have been no elections since Hamas was elected back in 2005. And Israel does not want free and fair elections for the Palestinians because they won't allow people in Jerusalem to vote because they don't want Jerusalem to be considered part of Palestinian territory. So there are so many political issues bound up in this. The other option is, do you enforce a leadership upon the Palestinian people in Gaza? Who would that be? How would you force them to accept that? There really isn't a facility at the moment built for having democratic leadership inside Gaza because they don't have that sort of democratic system. So that's one that, of course, many Gazans desire to be built. But whether or not that can all be done at the same time as this rebuild, which will take years, potentially a decade, depending on how much money and manpower is put into it. I mean, really, looking ahead at the moment, those are questions that are so far off the immediate issues of helping people who are suffering so terribly from injury, from food, from starvation, who are trying to get back to their homes, who are trying to rebuild their homes. The question is, who will govern that? And probably whoever does end up governing Gaza in the future will be the figures that emerge during this period who help people to reconstruct their lives.
Leila Milana Allen, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing. Here is Carlotta Rebello with the day's other headlines.
Thanks, Andrew. Investigators have recovered the black boxes from the American Airlines jet, which collided with a U.S. Army helicopter, killing all 67 people on board as it approached an airport in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday night. The flight data recorders will now be examined by the National Transportation Safety Board, with a preliminary report set to be issued in 30 days. For the first time in Germany's post-war history, the country's parliament could pass a law thanks to the support of the far right. The motion, tabled by the opposition, wants to tighten immigration controls and needs the support of the Alternative for Germany party in order to pass. The result is expected early this afternoon. And fashion designer Kim Jones is leaving Dior Homme after a 7-year tenure. His departure from luxury group LVMH is the latest of a series of high-profile designer reshuffles as the industry faces its slowest growth in years. Jones held his final Dior menswear show last week. Those are today's headlines. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Carlotta. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. It has been a seismic week in the realm of artificial intelligence, which is still trying to assess the impact of DeepSeek, a Chinese generative AI model which, at least according to the brochures, was assembled and is operated at a fraction of the fantastic costs of its slightly more established Western rivals. Stocks in AI-related companies tanked sensationally, most notably that of American tech company Nvidia, which is worth roughly $500 billion less than it was this time last Friday. Well, I'm joined now by James McIntosh, senior markets columnist at the Wall Street Journal. James, has everyone stopped freaking out yet?
Hi, Andrew. Yeah, things have calmed down a lot for Nvidia, but the deep questions here remain. So Nvidia made back after an enormous plunge. On Monday, it rebounded quite significantly, made back about half, and it's been fairly volatile since. So it's up kind of 1.5% or so this morning ahead of the market open. Down 1.5% this morning ahead of the market open. But yes, it's people are still in that phase of trying to figure things out, and I would say at the moment, there's an awful lot of ignorance and a lot of unanswered questions. I
mean, everyone's had now a few days to contemplate DeepSeek and have a bit of a play around with it. Do we buy all the claims made about it, especially in terms of what it cost, i.e. very, very little compared to the fantastic amounts consumed by Western models of the same thing?
Well, there's been quite a lot of pushback on that. So part of that pushback is just a general lack of trust by much of the democratic world of anything Chinese. But part of it is also OpenAI, amusingly, is accusing DeepSeek of having kind of used OpenAI to help train its model, which, given the accusations that very, very many authors have got that OpenAI nicked their work in order to train its model, I find quite amusing. But of course, those sorts of things take the shine off a bit and clearly help the American AI companies. But again, we don't really know. I mean, it's the sort of thing that competitors say about each other. And at the moment, we haven't seen any public proof. There was also, DeepSeek's sort of technical brilliance was slightly tarnished when it turned out that they'd left a massive cybersecurity hole in their systems. That as soon as the cybersecurity researchers came across this company, they'd never really heard of it before. They started looking at it and just almost immediately found this enormous backdoor into their systems. So yeah, there are a few sort of technical questions going on, but at the same time, the leaders of the big US AI companies have mostly seemed to have recognized that this is a real change in, they have found a genuine thing about how to do it. And it may not be quite as dramatic in cost terms as some of the initial speculation, but even without that, it's still a very big improvement. In terms of cost.
It did also, of course, demonstrate blind spots about certain aspects of Chinese history when inquisitive hacks asked what had happened in Tiananmen Square in June 1989 and received a response to the effect of, "I've no idea what you're talking about." But are we seeing here, do you think...
Actually, the amusing thing is it says things like, let's talk about something else.
But are we seeing here, do you think, some kind of parallel with the early dot-com boom of the 90s, where everybody was terrifically excited about this thing called the internet and everyone was willing to fling astonishing quantities of money and optimism in its direction, but nobody had quite yet figured out what it was going to be?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. We don't know what the business model is here. So we don't know. So Microsoft's planning on sinking 80 billion, for example, this year into new data centers, which is an enormous amount of money, $80 billion. An enormous amount of money to build data centers. President Trump led an announcement with a bunch of big companies trailing the prospect, and I say very much prospect rather than guarantee, but of $500 billion into new data centers. So these are enormous amounts of money is going in, but we don't really know how AI is going to be used, who it's going to be used by. It's great to play with if you want to get it to tell jokes or write you novels in the style of William Shakespeare or these sorts of things. It's very good at that. If you want something where it doesn't make stupid mistakes, so far quite a lot of generative AI models have fallen short. So there's still sort of question marks about how widely it will be adopted by business, and indeed how much business will be willing to pay for it in order to get the hoped for productivity gains. But then the further question is, who will the winners be? What sorts of AI models will win? One of the big issues that's raised by DeepSeek is that maybe this will be a commodity. Maybe it's not as hard to produce as everyone claims. There won't be so many barriers to entry. It'll be a much more competitive market, in which case the returns on these huge investments that these big tech companies are making might be dramatically lower than investors have been banking on, and that would obviously justify a lower stock price.
James McIntosh with The Wall Street Journal. Thanks for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. The Arctic Frontiers Conference has become more and more relevant in the last 3 years. Moscow's invasion of Ukraine has focused minds, with one session of this year's conference focusing on the Russian Arctic in wartime. Sør-Varanger, Monocle's Oslo correspondent, who is far north in Tromsø for the conference, sat down with Mongus Malland, the mayor of Sør-Varanger, the only Norwegian municipality bordering Russia, to discuss how once a relatively backwater location has become the focus of some of the world's most powerful countries.
Magnus Malland, I'm the mayor of Sør-Varanger in the northeast of Norway.
So for anyone who has not got a PhD in Norwegian geography, tell me where Sør-Varanger municipality is and what the importance of that municipality is, sort of on a geopolitical scale.
Sør-Varanger is the only municipality in Norway that has a border to Russia, and we also border to Finland. So we are a multinational, international place, typical border city. We are at the start or the end of a future Northern Sea route. We have all the minerals and the food and the experiences we need in a green transition. So we are the most strategic, important area in the high north of Norway.
And how do you notice that as mayor? How are the sort of international interests making themselves known?
Well, I'm more visited by international media and international ambassadors than national media, because we have everything Europe needs for industrial autonomy, and at the same time we are in the bastion defense of the Russian army. So we have to acknowledge that trade policies and harvesting of natural resources is also security policy. So my job is to create opportunities, and my job is to create opportunities that could benefit Europe, EU and NATO.
Now, we know that Russia is the by far largest Arctic nation since Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Cooperation has been on near zero. But there are other nations that are showing their interest. Tell me about that.
When I became mayor, there were 3 delegations from China that knocked on my door in the first month of my period as mayor. And that was challenging. Norway has, and Europe and EU has ties to China, but we want to build our European industrial autonomy. We want to trade but not be dependent. So I just had, of course, good communication with the State Department of Norway and the Foreign Department, and was pretty clear that we will not sell any critical infrastructure, and of course some investments can come, but not in areas that is of national interest.
So how would you describe the change to your municipality in terms of the relationship to Russia and Russians since 2022?
It's been a total shift. As a border city, we have close ties to Inari in Finland and Pechenga in Russia. We are 10,000 people. We have 400 ethnic Russians living in our municipality, but also 300 Ukrainians. and we are a multicultural place. But when we have closed the door to Russia and said hello to the EU and NATO, and my predecessors spent more time with Chinese delegation and Russian delegation than with the US and EU and NATO. So that was a big shift for the municipalities. But people wanted it. I campaigned on it, and we won the election on it.
Finally, what do you make of President Trump's overtures or threats, if you like, towards Greenland?
There's a saying, just don't listen to what Trump says, but look what the hands do. And you have to remember that the last time Trump was president, there had never been more US troops in Europe. And it's in the US interest that Europe becomes strong, and we are the strongest ally to the US. So breathe, be calm, and then do not react too early.
Magnus, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Lars Bavanger speaking to Mongus Morland. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. In 2013, the Australian journalist Peter Greste, then working for Al Jazeera, was arrested in Cairo and sentenced to 7 years on charges of, among other things, having a detrimental impact on the image of Egypt abroad. Many at the time reasonably retorted that locking up journalists for doing their job probably doesn't help much on this front. During the 400 days he eventually served, Peter befriended Alaa Abd al-Fattah, a veteran Egyptian dissident. Alaa, also a British citizen, is once again imprisoned in Egypt, and Peter is undertaking a hunger strike in protest. Peter joins me in the studio now. Peter, first of all, I realise that you are not the focus of this story, but our listeners will be curious. How are you holding up?
I'm fine. I'm surprising amount of energy at the moment and mental focus and clarity. It's quite a surprise. I mean, I've been speaking to quite a few people in preparation for this, and they told me that I could expect this, but I never really believed them. But no, I'm feeling pretty good.
Because you're about 10 or 11 days into 21 days of this?
Today's day 12.
Okay. And what are you actually surviving on?
Water, sugar-free electrolytes and salt. That's it.
Okay, well, this is an expression of sympathy for your friend. And how did you actually meet each other at the time? Because obviously you met under extremely straitened circumstances.
Yeah, that's right. As you said, I'd been arrested in Cairo. In fact, the charges were a bit more serious than what you just mentioned. I was on charges of terrorism, being involved with a terrorist organisation, advocating terrorist ideology.
I did
and
say,
so on.
among other things.
Yes, well, that's the other things. And I went almost immediately into solitary confinement. And I didn't speak Arabic. I was only due to be there for a short period covering the bureau. And I didn't know where I was, who I'd been imprisoned with, what on earth was going on, the politics behind it. And Allah, at great risk to himself, came outside the cell and whispered through the door and told me what was going on, where I was, and told me that I was okay, that I was in a political wing of the prison and that I was with friends. And he really helped give me the psychological tools that I needed to escape prison and afterwards, or to survive prison rather. And afterwards he gave me the political tools that I needed to help frame the campaign that ultimately got me out.
Alaa is, of course, in prison now. What is the reason he is now in? Because this has been a tiresomely recurring theme of his life. And what's the latest on his general condition?
He's also in prison on charges of publishing false news to undermine the integrity of the state or the reputation of the state. But in fact, I think it has a lot more to do with his extraordinary reputation as a humanitarian, as a pro-democracy activist. He was one of the leaders of the January 25th revolution of 2011 that toppled Hosni Mubarak. But he served his term. He was given a 5-year sentence. He served his term and he should have been released on September 29th. Under Egyptian law, sentences include time served in pre-trial detention. But the Egyptian government is now, in violation of its own laws, saying, no, we're going to count your sentence from the day that you were actually convicted, and that would add an extra 2 years to the time that he'll be behind bars.
He is also a UK citizen, and I know that while you've been in London, you've been trying to make his case to various British potentates. How seriously do you feel like they're taking this?
I think they are taking it seriously. And just by the way, I need to mention that it's not just me that's on a hunger strike. It's Allah's mother who started her hunger strike on the day that he was supposed to be released. And now she's 124 days without food. An extraordinarily tough woman. And the family is very well organised. They've had meetings with the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy. He went last week to Cairo to specifically negotiate with Allah, for Allah's release, rather. He came back empty-handed, and the family is grateful for that kind of engagement. But the family also believes that the only person who can unlock Allah's door is the President Sisi himself, and that would require the involvement of the Prime Minister Keir Starmer. President Sisi won't respond to anyone less than another, than someone who he sees as his political equal, and that would be the Prime Minister.
I mean, what is your read on why President al-Sisi fears your friend, as he very clearly does? Because I think we can take it as read that the suggestion that he is meaningfully any kind of terrorist is preposterous.
No, absolutely. And as I mentioned, I think it is because Allah is extraordinarily popular across Egypt. He is without doubt the country's best known political prisoner. He has the capacity to mobilise a lot of people if he wants to involve himself in Egyptian politics. And I think the president is terrified of that. Having said that, I know that Allah is fed up. He wants to come to the UK to be with his wife, to be with his child, and his mother and his brother and his sisters. He wants to get on with his normal life. He's been through this for far too long.
Peter Greste, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing. The Foreign Desk is Monocle Radio's weekly world affairs programme. We tackle the biggest global news stories as well as those too often left untold.
I've been out on the streets of Lagos. People are unable to withdraw their cash. Fights have broken out in banking halls.
As well as the occasional retelling of events from days long past.
The gates opened and in came this horse, absolutely huge, made of wood. People were asking, what's it for? Is it some kind of icon?
Our expert guests offer in-depth analysis and first-hand experience.
There were a lot of diplomatic efforts by NATO and NATO allies. We really made big efforts to convince Russia not to invade.
The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller, is available every Saturday from midday London time, right here on Monocle Radio. For now, though, I'm hosting The Briefing on Monocle Radio, and it is time now for a roundup of theatre news from Broadway to the West End. And to do exactly that, I'm joined in the studio by Matt Wolfe, theatre critic at the International New York Times. Matt, you have a list here of things playing now and forthcoming that you wanted to discuss. First up, Inside Number 9 at Wyndham's.
Well, this is part of the ongoing trend at the moment to bring television to the stage. So you have Fawlty Towers on TV, then on stage. You have Stranger Things on television, then you have the prequel on stage. This is a very popular television series, of course, some of which has been brought to the stage, and there's some new material. For me, I'm not a connoisseur of the television series, so I came to it cold, which I think is interesting. And what I like best is what any theater person would like best. The first 15, 20 minutes are the most devastatingly funny critique of theater etiquette on stage that I've ever seen. Once it lapses into kind of a recreation of the series, I kind of tuned out. But then the second act, which brings us back into the world of a haunted theater, a blood-drenched spirit called Bloody Bell, it gets fun again. But if you go in a kind of meta-theatrical frame of mind, you'll have a good time.
Which aspects of theatre etiquette were they teeing off on?
Well, of course, mobile phones, laptops, talking, getting up to go to the loo. But it normally, in real life, in my experience anyway, doesn't eventuate in violence. In this case, it very much does.
I think it should.
Well, on the evidence of this show, Andrew, I think it will. This is not a pastiche. Perhaps it's a primer of how to behave.
we can only hope so. Moving along to The Gift at the Park Theatre.
Yes, I've seen several shows in a row that are making a bit of a fetish of excrement. I'm not quite sure what this says, maybe in the constipated days of winter. But this is a play that pretends to be a gross-out comedy and then becomes kind of faux Beckett. But if you can believe it, the catalyst for it all is a beautiful pastry box which is delivered to this insecure bachelor, which turns out to contain a lump of turd. Now, this is the kind of thing where you don't do that with theatre critics, because then they can just say, well, the play is a lump of turd.
The gags write themselves, yes.
It's like Bad Cinderella on Broadway. Why would you call the show that? But actually, what Dave Flores has written is much closer to one of these Yasmina Reza plays of old, like Art, A God of Carnage, where kind of civility is put under the microscope and the excrement becomes, shall I just say, a conduit for other much more sort of personal arguments about how one lives one's life, bachelorhood, kind of familial dysfunction. So, but as catalysts go, it's sort of a gross-out one. There's a line about somebody or other being a poopatrator. It's that kind of thing.
Okay, but by and large, it justifies the temptation of, because you're right. If you give critics the open goal, they will take it. I'm flashing back to many years ago, a colleague at Melody Maker tasked with reviewing a record called All the Way Up and merely filing the review, don't tempt me.
Yes, I think the thing with this show is that it wrong-foots you deliberately. You think it's just going to be sort of an end of pure entertainment, and actually it becomes cod existentialism. Now, if that's not what you want, you're going to have a miserable time. On the other hand, if you think that gives it a bit more, dare I say the word, flavor, then you might enjoy it.
Well, looking ahead a bit, we have exciting times coming up for Sophocles fans.
Yeah, I mean, who would have thought, like the proverbial London bus, two productions of Sophocles classics opening back-to-back, both starring recent Oscar winners making their West End debuts. On Tuesday coming, Rami Malek from Bohemian Rhapsody is opening in the title role of Oedipus, and the following night, Brie Larson from Room is opening in the title role of Electra. So if you want to kind of compare and contrast complexes, this is the perfect time. And what's really odd is that there was just a very good, entirely separate production of Oedipus on the West End with Mark Strong and Leslie Manville. So something's in the water.
Well, I was just going to say, because journalistic wisdom teaches us that 1 is a thing, 2 is a coincidence, 3 is a trend.
Yeah.
Have we arrived for some reason at some Sophoclean moment?
There are lots of theories about this. I like to think these plays are pitched at extremes. Perhaps we live in times that are as well. They ask a lot of actors. Actors like to be pushed. There's nothing sedate about them. People like, to corral their energy. The time is right for plays that push towards the abyss.
Matt Wolfe, thank you as always for joining us. And that is it for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Tom Webb. Our researcher was Maisie Rayner and the studio manager was Flynn Simons. The Briefing is back on Monday at the same time. I'm Andrew Mullett. Thanks for listening.